Okay. Thank you, Francisca. I'm in my backyard, and you may hear songbirds. Sometimes I have this very loud cardinal singing in the back. So I think all these songbirds are welcoming this conference. Um, so I bring greetings from Greensboro, North Carolina, the traditional land of the Kiwani and Saura nations. Today, I have the honor of introducing our distinguished keynote speaker, Srivanka Banerjee. He's an artist, writer, activist, conservationist, and public scholar. He serves as the Lannan Foundation Endowed Chair and Professor of Art and Ecology at the University of New Mexico. At the university, he is also the founding director of both the Center for Environmental Arts and Humanities and the Species in Peril project. Srivanka originally hails from a small town near Calcutta in West Bengal, India. He studied electrical engineering in Calcutta and proceeded to pursue graduate work at the New Mexico State University and earned graduate degrees in both physics and computer science. Upon graduation, he worked as a research scientist for 6 years, working for the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, and then at Boeing in Seattle. But he has always loved photography, and through spending his free time in nature, his concern for the disappearing land, wildlife, and indigenous cultures grew. In 2000, he left Boeing to become a full-time artist, educator, and activist. From 2001 to 2002, he spent 14 months photographing the life in the Arctic. In the following year, published a book, Seasons of Life in Land, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This book played a crucial role in defeating legislation to open the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge for gas and oil exploration in 2003. Senator Barbara Boxer used photographs from the books to show the Arctic as an indispensable and sacred home to both indigenous communities and non-human species. From that very first book, Srivanka's work has sought to transform our consciousness about the spaces that we may see as wasteland or non-significant into rich, vibrant, living places. His work has focused on two human-caused planetary crises, biological annihilation and climate breakdown. These days, we're beginning to see more attention being paid to climate crisis, which is great news. However, we have not paid nearly enough attention to the concurrent devastating impacts our modern, industrialized, anthropocentric culture has caused on our indigenous brothers and sisters, fellow species, and ecological systems that support the life on this planet. Srivanka's work summons our senses to the interconnectedness of species, massacres, and climate breakdown. In addressing these interlocking crises, he introduced the idea of long environmentalism, where over decades of struggles, unlikely allies come together under the shared ethical livability for both humans and more than humans. His land-based, community-engaged work in the Arctic, New Mexico, and India has been a journey of this long environmentalism to achieve multi-species justice, where conservation of biotic life is in alignment with environmental justice and indigenous rights. His conservation work has been recognized in myriad ways, including the awards he received from the United Nations Environment Program, the Lannan Foundation, the National Wildlife Federation, and the Alaska Wilderness League, and the Sierra Club. His academic contributions have been recognized through the visiting scholar and artist in residence posts he received over the years from universities, including the University of Utah, Dartmouth College, Princeton University, Fordham University, the University of Cambridge, and Davidson College. So I can go on for hours to talk about his accomplishments. However, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Srivanka Banerjee.
Thank you, Etsuko, for those really kind and warm words. Greetings, everyone. Let me get situated. You can hear me? Everyone can hear me okay? Is the sound coming out okay? My heart is filled with gratitude right now. I'm really humbled that Etsuko, you suggested my name, and Mark and Barbara and everyone who agreed to that idea. I also thank Dr. Mark Meissner for inviting me to give this talk, and Dr. Barbara Willard and the IECA Conference Committee for giving such prominence to wild animals and plants, our non-human kin. A big thank you to everyone for joining from around the world, across so many different time zones. In fact, I was going to say happy Solstice Day, but Barb earlier mentioned that you all are joining from all over. I'm speaking to you from New Mexico, the traditional homelands of the indigenous Pueblo, Diné, Apache, and the Ute peoples. Let me see if I can pull up the presentation. Bear with me, unlike Mark, who I hear is a tech guru, I am always technologically challenged. Let's see if this comes up. And Mark, you have, let's see if I can do the share screen. Is this still coming through okay?
Looking good.
Oh.
Oh, no, you gotta go.
No, something happened. Hold on.
So when you go to share screen, you can choose to share a specific window. Just share that PowerPoint window.
Oh, I see. What did I do? Okay, stop sharing. This is why I said I am technologically challenged. Okay, hold on. Let's see. 1 second, we'll get there. Share screen, entire screen, right?
No, pick window, a window.
Oh, window. Ah, okay.
And then pick that PowerPoint window.
And that's now coming through, okay?
There you go. Perfect.
Oops. Every time I do a hide, it goes away. Hold on. What did I do? Is that
It's
okay
there.
now?
Yep,
Oh,
it's showing
it's there.
it. Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Okay, sorry about that confusion. Okay, so I must admit that I am a little nervous because I'm not a scholar of communication. So I come to you from many different mixed bag of things, as Etsuko so kindly pointed out. It would be fair to say that, and many speakers before me have already acknowledged that today there is global public acknowledgement of the human-caused climate crisis, which is being articulated with different names: climate breakdown, climate emergency, and others. Majority of the people from around the world recognize the existence of the climate crisis, have a general understanding of the scale and scope and the severity, and are asking for meaningful mitigation. The youth are no longer portrayed in visual culture of environmental communication as symbols of vulnerability, but instead are at the forefront of global climate justice movements today. Think of Greta Thunberg and countless other person of color youth who are engaged in climate justice actions all across the world. Sadly, we cannot say the same about the biodiversity crisis, which many of us consider to be just as significant, just as severe, just as consequential and just as difficult to mitigate as the climate crisis. The two crises, biodiversity and climate, are different. Each has its own set of drivers, although there are overlaps. And each also contributes to the escalation of the other in significant ways. But while the climate crisis is finally getting the much needed and long overdue public attention, the biodiversity crisis is continuing to fester from public inattention. There is no Greta Thunberg to shout a biodiversity slogan, "Our house is getting lonely," akin to her famous slogan on climate breakdown, "Our house is on fire." I will return to that image in the title slide later in the talk. Okay. As it turns out, nearly 30 years ago, both climate and biodiversity were prominently recognized, and two separate initiatives were established at the same historic Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. At Rio, the United Nations established the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to address the climate crisis, and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity to address the biodiversity crisis. Only one of those has made significant progress, while the other has been lagging, although meaningful progress is finally being made in the last few years following the establishment of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES. We now ask the big question: why is biodiversity crisis continuing to fester from public inattention despite the UN efforts and so much good scientific research being done? Oops. There is no solid answer because there has not been any systematic and comprehensive study to answer that question. I will share with you my 2 cents. In my humble estimation, there are 3 things that are significant and likely contributors. Number 1, the use, abuse, and overuse of the term extinction. And along with that, the premature popularization of the term sixth extinction. Number 2, doubts and confusion in biodiversity communication. And number 3, lazy and irresponsible journalism. I will go through each one in turn. Communication is at the heart of all of these. So that's why I'm so grateful that you gave me this opportunity to share with you a few ideas. And by that, I mean, how are we communicating the biodiversity crisis to the public? In today's talk, my primary audience is really the public. Everything I'm writing, saying is keeping the public in mind, front and center. What language, what visuals, what frames, what messages are we using? And what role has the media been playing in all of this so far? Let's begin with the use, abuse, and overuse of the term extinction, which above all else may turn out to be more harmful than helpful in communicating the biodiversity crisis to the general public. But we are largely unaware of that and its nuances. We are obsessed with extinction of individual species, which I think stems from the obsession with individual over collective that plagues the dominant white Western culture. Extinction is not equal to the human-caused biodiversity crisis. Extinction plays only a very small part in a much larger narrative. A number of books with extinction on the title or subtitle have been published in recent years, with the most influential being Elizabeth Kolber's The Sixth Extinction. And you see a selection here. There are many, many more. Also consider the use of extinction in some other spheres as well, namely journalism and grassroots movement. That's a journalism and grassroots movement. The Age of Extinction series from The Guardian and Extinction Rebellion movement that started in the UK. And finally, and perhaps of greatest significance, is the May 2019 Green Warning from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that 1 million animal and plant species face extinction due to human activity. Let us pause for a moment and let that number sink in. 1 million. Think of all the art and literature that have been created to address the past extinction of a handful of species, say the passenger pigeon or the dodo, quite a bit actually. The potential extinction of 1 million species is beyond our cultural comprehension at the moment. Let us now perform a simple thought experiment. Alarmed by all of these extinction narratives, you organize an educational outreach event in your community, in your village, in your town, in your city. Several hundred community members have come to hear you. You give a deeply informative and compelling talk. But during the Q&A session, an audience member asks you a very simple question. Have you yourself seen a species go extinct? Question mark. The person further clarifies that by seen, they mean if you have personally seen the last member of a species before the species went extinct and was declared so. You are caught off guard. You scratch your head for a few seconds and then you offer an honest answer. No. Of course, if you were an early 19th century zookeeper at the Cincinnati Zoo who took care of Martha, the last known passenger pigeon, you would have said yes. But for most of the rest of us, we would answer no. I had a similar moment of embarrassment myself earlier this year. It was a private one though, not public. On January 6, 2021, the infamous day of insurrection against the US Capitol, the AFP News in France posted on its Facebook page an infographic built with data provided by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, which, quote, confirmed the extinction in 2020 of 36 plant and animal species not seen for decades, unquote. The infographic listed only the scientific names of species, which I was not familiar with. So I started to look up the common names for each. Ufaga speciosa, I'm probably mispronouncing all of this, so forgive me for that if there are scientists in the audience, is splendid poison frog, last seen in Panama in 1992. Roystonia stellata is a palm tree last seen in Cuba in 1939. Ameles fascipinnis is pine dwarf mantis, last seen in Italy 1871. Barbodes amarus is a small fish that lived in Lake Lanao in the Philippines and was known locally as pite and last seen in 1982. After I completed the exercise, I realized that I had never seen or known any of these 36 species. Let us return to that gathering that you were addressing. There is now audible murmur among the audience, getting louder, and before long, it is determined that no one in the audience has seen a species go extinct. Now what? You can try to convince all who had come to listen to you to believe in famous people like Elizabeth Colbert or influential newspaper like The Guardian or the very well-meaning United Nations. Like one might place their faith in God. Or you can let everyone go back home with confusion and doubts about human-caused extinction. After the let us dive a little deeper into confusion and doubts, starting with the year 2014. That year, Elizabeth Colbert's The Sixth Extinction was published, which won a Pulitzer Prize and prematurely popularized the term sixth extinction. While the book received wide public acclaim, what happened following the publication of The Sixth Extinction is not widely known, which also deserves our close attention and critical analysis. After the publication of The Sixth Extinction, later that year, PBS, which is the national public television in the United States, aired a short 9-minute, 12-second video. Are we living in the sixth extinction? With a question mark. The video was posted on YouTube on November 14th, 2014, and which, as of this past Saturday, when I last checked, had nearly 3.8 million views. A lot. In the video, the narrator highlights with a slide that studies of current extinction rates indicates that mammals are going extinct at 1,000 times faster and amphibians at 45,000 times faster than normal. To make the matter even more apocalyptic, as if that would draw the attention of the public, the engaging narrator says, quote, "And since there are so many species still unknown or uncharacterized, all of those numbers are probably underestimates." Wait a minute. Are these numbers based in reality? Are these numbers too high? Here is what happened next. As the year turned, a team of biologists from top universities in Mexico and the United States, including Gerardo Ceballos and Paul Ehrlich, published a paper in Science Advances. The scientists asserted that the, quote, "average rate of vertebrate species loss over the last century is up to 100 times higher than the background rate, not 1,000 for mammals or 45,000 for amphibians, as was mentioned in the previous video." More fuel started getting added to the fire of confusion and doubts, with varieties of extinction rates started getting suggested by scientists. To help clear some fog, the same year, journalist Fred Pierce wrote an article published in Yale Environment 360. Pierce cited various rates of extinctions that were being suggested and pointed out that, quote, "nobody knows whether such estimates are anywhere close to reality," unquote. He then offered an explanation on why the rates vary so widely. Quote, "they are based on computer modeling and documented losses are tiny by comparison. Only about 800 extinctions have been documented in the past 400 years, according to data held by the International Union for the conservation of nature. Likely realizing that their larger call to action was getting lost in unproductive debates, Ceballos and Ehrlich teamed up with Rodolfo Dirzo and wrote a seminal paper, Biological Annihilation, via the ongoing sixth mass extinction signaled by vertebrate population losses and declines, which was published 2 years later in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. Here is what happened next. Quote, is a sixth mass extinction already happening? Question mark was the headline in Cosmos. And quote, Earth is not in the midst of a sixth mass extinction, unquote, was the headline in the Atlantic. The Smithsonian scientist Douglas Irwin, who wrote the book Extinction, How Life on Earth Nearly Ended 250 million years ago, is quoted in both articles. Irwin says that we are not in the midst of sixth extinction. If we did, then, quote, there is no point in conservation biology, unquote. We do know that there have been 902 recorded extinction in the past 520 years. According to the latest data from the IUCN, and was reported in the Atlantic earlier this year. The extinction of 902 species over the past half a millennium is no small number. But if the immediate past is any guide to the future, it would be a hard sell to affirmatively establish that we are in the midst of a sixth mass species extinction, or to casually accept that 1 million species now face extinction in the near future. All of this undoubtedly creates doubts and confusion in the minds of the public. I will make an observation at this juncture. The single reason the climate justice movement steadily gained momentum and became more and more solid is because there was no significant doubts or confusion among the public about various impacts of the climate crisis. The only doubts that were being sown were by the climate deniers, which were easy to ridicule and dismiss. But in case of the biodiversity crisis, doubts and uncertainties about the scope and severity of the crisis are coming from the scientists and getting amplified in the media. This is not good. For the biodiversity crisis to enjoy widespread public attention and engagement, we need clarity and precision in communication, not confusion. While I'm not qualified enough to take part in the debate on whether the Earth is in the midst of sixth extinction or not, we can certainly move beyond the logjam and engage with a more productive part of the Ceballos, Ehrlich, Dirzo 2017 paper. The scientists write, our data indicates that beyond global species extinctions, Earth is experiencing a huge episode of population declines and extirpations, unquote. The scientists write. That paper introduced the term biological annihilation, which includes human-caused species extinctions and population declines. The latter would include, in common language, direct killing or massacre, various sorts of die-offs, and slow extirpations that largely remain out of our sight and happen gradually, a form of violence that writer Rob Nixon calls slow violence. I wrote an article to popularize the term biological annihilation as it resonated with me because I could share with the public a few stories of my own witnessing of species die-offs. But I will now share with you some new analysis, which is not in that article, that I have been thinking about over the past 3 years. The expansion of the frame from extinction to biological annihilation is crucial for opening up the biodiversity crisis to cultural analysis. We can now bring in tools from environmental humanities to analyze the crisis more deeply and expansively than has happened so far. I enumerate below a few significant benefits of this expansion. Rather than waiting for an uncertain future, when an extinction might happen or not, the expansion will encourage us to engage with the present, ongoing species die-offs, massacres, and slow extirpations. The focus on population declines will also bring the crisis closer to home, a spatial shift. Rather than mourning which is no more, the expansion will encourage us to fight for the survival of the living, most importantly, the overlooked species, bugs, for example. The expansion will help us get past the confusion over extinction rates and whether we are in the midst of sixth extinction or not. It would help circumvent engaging with the difficult topic of declaring whether a species is extinct or not yet. It would help cool the distracting topic of the sudden sighting of a species that was long considered to be extinct, which takes up significant media coverage. Rather than the distraction of de-extinction, fodder for Hollywood, remember Jurassic Park, that prey on misguided nostalgia, the expansion will help us to focus on the real tragedy at hand and its mitigation. The expanded frame will help expose more effectively the myriad cultural, economic, and political drivers of biological annihilation, including and most importantly, colonialism and capitalism. We care about and mourn the death of large number of fellow humans from war, famine, drought, flood, fires, without ever having the need to invoke the possibility of human extinction. Similarly, it would be necessary to start caring about large-scale population declines of wild animals and plants without the need to invoke the possibility of their extinction. A species does not need to go extinct to highlight human-caused biological mayhem. If we keep focusing exclusively on extinction, which happens relatively rarely and gradually and often in remote places out of most of our sight, not to mention the process of declaring a species extinct is long and difficult, we will fail or slow down the process to make biological annihilation a public crisis. Our first task would be to frame the crisis with stories coming from closer to where we live and with actual events that we can experience right now. Let us return to that thought experiment. Why is it necessary, you might ask, that the public have to see and experience the biodiversity crisis themselves for them to believe in it and engage in mitigation efforts? Why can't they simply believe in famous people like Colbert's Sixth Extinction, Guardian's Age of Extinction, and the Grim Extinction Warning from the IPBES? Oh, okay, let's see. In February 2002, one second. In February 2002, at the Snow Change Workshop in Tampere, Finland, the indigenous peoples of the circumpolar Arctic drafted and adopted a resolution which pointed out that, quote, the residents of the circumpolar north, especially the indigenous communities, are already witnessing disturbing and severe climatic and ecological changes. Unquote. The resolution also noted that, quote, very little has actually been done to address the root causes of this change, unquote. It then offered a reason for the inaction. Quote, this is in part because the majority of the Earth's citizens have not seen any significant climate changes thus far and may not see any until major ecological damage has already been done, unquote. The Tampere resolution highlighted that experiencing a crisis is a necessary condition for sincere actions and grassroots mobilizations. That largely unknown and overlooked indigenous resolution proved prescient. Today, majority of the Earth's citizens are demanding climate justice because they themselves have experienced varieties of impacts of climate breakdown. Think of Black Lives Matter. Think of missing and murdered indigenous women. Think of violence against Asian Americans. All of these have been happening in the United States. But the reason there are mass mobilizations to address inequity and injustice against Black, brown, and the indigenous peoples in the United States is because people have been experiencing violence personally and or their loved ones have been affected by such violence. Similarly, the public have to see and experience the biodiversity crisis themselves to demand actions for mitigation. And that cannot happen if we keep bringing up extinction or the sixth extinction, which remains beyond the realm of experience and seeing for most. We have to instead talk about that which most of us can see and experience. Let us return to the thought experiment one more time. What if you had asked the audience this question instead? Have you witnessed a species die-off or massacre? The answer will likely be yes from many in the audience. Varieties of die-offs and massacres surround us. All we have to do is pay attention. Last fall, US Senator Tom Udall and I co-hosted the UNM Biodiversity webinar series. And you can see 4 of the announcement videos from that series. Just as we were about to launch the series, however, a major bird die-off unfolded in New Mexico. Members of at least 222 bird species died in that one event, according to the iNaturalist Southwest Avian Mortality Project that ran from August 1 through October 31 of last year, and included observations by trained as well as citizen scientists. Senator Udall and I mentioned the die-off in a co-authored opinion piece we wrote for Scientific American. I did not have to explain the biodiversity crisis to my students. They simply walked around their neighborhoods and many of them found dead birds, which they then addressed in their creative and scholarly assignments for the class. The expansion from extinction to biological annihilation closes a temporal gap from what might happen in the future to what is happening right now, and a spatial gap from what is happening in remote location that most of us cannot see to where we live, and an emotional gap from believing in what the experts are saying to experiencing it ourselves, a particular tragedy at this very moment. Suddenly, the biodiversity crisis no longer feels abstract and out of reach as it did with extinction, but feels very real and palpable. We all can experience biological annihilation and tell our own stories, create our own art. Over the past 2 decades, I have personally witnessed at least 4 mass species die-offs. The die-off of Pinon in my home state, New Mexico State Tree. About 90% of mature pinons died in northern New Mexico between 2001 and 2005, which then sparked a mass bird die-off in which 73% abundance and 45% diversity perished in the Pajarito Plateau. The sea stars die-off along the Pacific coast. More than 20 species of sea stars perished from Mexico to Alaska, with 99% population decline in many sites, which then sparked cascading change at the edge of the sea. The die-off of the southern Beaufort Sea polar bear population in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, about 40% population decline between 2006 and 2010, and the bird die-off in New Mexico last fall. These experiences have helped me to appreciate the scale of the biological crisis firsthand and make commitment to help the public understand what is happening to our non-human kin with whom we share this earth. The picture that you see is a photograph of a sea star I made in the Pacific coast of the Olympic National Park in 2014. I made that image as an homage to Rachel Carson. In her book, The Age of the Sea, Carson describes a moment of elation, of seeing a sea star hanging from a rock and its body reflected on the calm tide pool beneath. In my case, the arrangement was similar, but instead it was a moment of despair as I photographed the sea star in the act of dying, having difficulty holding on to the rock. I titled the photograph, Remembering Rachel Carson at the Edge of the Sea. Beyond the personal witnessing, the larger loss is staggering. In October 2018, the Living Planet report was published by the WWF and the Zoological Society London, which stated that between 1970 and 2014, monitored populations of vertebrates or amphibians, birds, fishes, mammals, and reptiles have declined in abundance by an average of 60% globally. In Latin and Central America, the loss was most pronounced, an average 89%. And for freshwater species globally, 83% decline on average. What happens next makes visible what I would call lazy journalism that created doubts among the minds of the public. I know this because at the time I was teaching a biodiversity class and was paying close attention. Journalists of such highly regarded newspapers as The Guardian and the Washington Post did not even bother to read the report carefully and published articles with headlines that were misleading and simply wrong. Like this Guardian headline, quote, "Humanity has wiped out 60% of animal populations since 1970, report finds," unquote. The Guardian environment editor got it wrong on so many counts that it was deeply embarrassing for me and my students. First, the report was on vertebrate species, not all animals. Next, the report focused on monitored populations, not all population. Next, and very important, the report assessed average population declines, not absolute across the board. All of this matter. The average is key here, which I can go on into more detail during the Q&A if needed, but you can also read Ed Young's wonderful article in The Atlantic, Young took the time to understand the report and explained it in very accessible and helpful language, the significance of average. The kind of lazy journalism on biodiversity that The Guardian exhibited in 2018 is continuing to this day. The UK government had commissioned the influential Cambridge University Indian economist Professor Partho Dasgupta to write a report on the intersection of the biodiversity crisis and economics. Earlier this year, the Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review, a 610-page report was published. Here is what happened. As the day before the report was released, the influential Guardian journalist George Monbiot, whose writing I admire very much and have done so for many years, tweeted and trashed the report by anticipating its analysis, which then resulted in his Twitter followers. And of course, as you can imagine, being Monbiot, thousands of supporters probably, or followers, and trashed the report. Followers also trashed the report. Nobody actually read the report. It does not matter whether we agree or critique an assessment, but we need to exercise rigor, which Monbiot failed to do. He didn't even read the report before tweeting, only anticipated its overall approach and analysis. In the end, I may agree with Monbiot's analysis, but I may also find 5 pages in a 610-page report that might be useful to communicate the biodiversity crisis to the public. Monbiot foreclosed that possibility. This is another example of lazy and superficial, irresponsible, and ultimately very damaging form of communication. Such instances are very, very counterproductive if we are to faithfully communicate the myriad complexities of the biodiversity crisis to the public. How can the public trust the Age of Extinction series from The Guardian when all of these things have been happening? Having said all that, the numbers in the 2020 Living Planet report only got worse in every category. Between 1970 and 2016, amphibians, birds, fishes, mammals, and reptiles declined in abundance by an average of 68% globally. In South and Central America, the loss is still the most pronounced, on average 94%, and for freshwater species globally, 84% decline on average. That tragedy is not yet registering in our collective imagination, however. Have you witnessed or organized a collective mourning to honor our dead non-human relatives, as we often do for our human kin? Have you seen any flowers, real or plastic, placed by the roadside or at a town square to honor the dead bugs and bees? I have not. We now turn our attention to a different thread. Earlier this year, I said that the United Nations is finally making some progress on addressing the biodiversity crisis. That is happening because of the recent efforts of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which was established in 2012 following a directive from the United Nations General Assembly. I take issue with that name, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Should public policy on mitigating biological annihilation, the saddest story in human history, be guided only by science and economics? Should we also not consider the humanities, the arts? The story of biological annihilation since the dawn of the early modern age has been more about culture than science. We need an ethical lens as much as a scientific one to apprehend the crisis. As much as Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, offers the public impeccable science journalism, it completely avoids the subject of cultural analysis, which prompted literary studies scholar Ashley Dawson to write a concise primer, Extinction, A Radical History, which was published in 2016. Dawson writes, quote, extinction needs to be seen, along with climate change, as the leading edge of contemporary capitalism's contradictions, unquote. While Dawson urged us to consider the role of capitalism in biodiversity crisis, he did not go into an in-depth analysis. In addition to capitalism, we also need to understand the role of colonialism and imperial ambitions in advancing biological annihilation. Recent scholarship in history offers a broad understanding of the complex entanglement of colonialism, capitalism, and imperial ambitions driving biological annihilation since the dawn of the early modern age, 1500. Two concise but extraordinary books can serve as trusted guides. Late American historian John F. Richards says, "The World Hunt, an environmental history of the commodification of animals," and Indian historian Mahesh Rangarajan's India's Wildlife History. In an eye-opening chapter, Richards writes about the extraordinary scale of massacre of fur-bearing animals from eastern North America by French and the British. He also highlights the colonial significance of the massacre. Quote, "Profits from the fur trade financed European colonization and settlement in North America," unquote, Richards wrote. Biological annihilation was not only an enabler of colonization in North America, but also in India. In the late 18th century, the colonial British government offered special rewards in India for killing tigers, elephants, wild buffalo, Indian one-horned rhinoceros, and poisonous snakes. Mahesh Rangarajan writes that larger rewards were given out, quote, "larger rewards were given out for killing tigresses and special prizes for finishing up cubs," unquote. It was imperative to rid India of dangerous beasts to make the forest safe, so the trees and other biological life and mineral resources could be extracted smoothly without hazards, not only for the accumulation of wealth, but also for advancing colonization in the name of civilizing the uncivilized Indians. By 1870s, the British government in India had assessed, quote, "the best method of exterminating wild animals," unquote, Rangarajan writes. He also points out that the scale and speed of biological massacres executed by the British in India was unprecedented in India's wildlife history. The story of biological annihilation that I have so far mapped is rooted in an economy of extraction, which helped advance colonization by European imperial powers and contributed significantly to the accumulation of wealth by individuals, corporations, and nation states. Then there is also the economy of creation, products that we create and then consume, that also contribute to biological annihilation. The devastating impacts of the economy of creation was first highlighted in Rachel Carson's landmark book, Silent Spring. Carson wrote, quote, "The sudden silencing of the songs of birds, this obliteration of the color and beauty and interest that lay into our world have come about swiftly, insidiously, and unnoticed by those whose communities are as yet unaffected," unquote. But it isn't only the pesticides, but also mundane products like window glass through which we see the outside massacre life, specifically birds, at a great scale. Biological annihilation is not a byproduct of modern life, but rather modern life and modern institutions have been built in large part on biological massacres since the dawn of the early modern age. The story continues with industrial scale harvest, overharvest of fish and other aquatic life from the oceans and destruction of habitats on land to make room for industrial agriculture and to build our homes, including luxury seashore hotels and condos that destroy critical shorebird habitat. I now return finally to the title slide. I now turn to the final section where we will look at not the extinction of individual species, but rather the peril and protection of a group of very large number of species. The group of species we'll focus on are shorebirds. Please consider this as a case study for some of the ideas I have shared with you so far. I'm writing a book on biodiversity crisis and conservation. The chapter I'm now writing is on shorebirds. I focus on science, but also cultural and visual analysis that spans 200 years, from 1821 to 2021. My guides in this journey are 7 dear colleagues from across the Americas, each of whom has dedicated their entire professional career to study shorebirds and to help this group of species survive and thrive. Today, many in the United States know of the extinction of the passenger pigeon, but very few are aware of the scale and scope of shorebird massacre that also happened in the 19th and early 20th century. A long forgotten and an extraordinarily dark chapter in US history. Not one, but numerous species of shorebirds had to endure the Long Massacre. In 1895, Charles Scribner's Sons in New York released shooting pictures. This is, I'm right, like a little bit from the piece I have already written. A portfolio of dozen prints created by noted American illustrator A.B. Frost. The 11th print in the set is Bay Snipe, an extraordinary image with which we can open up conversation on a dark and overlooked chapter in American history, the Shorebird Massacre, which was accomplished by gunning, firelighting, and trapping to supply wild game markets in cities across the country. Three things converged in the 19th century that led to unimaginable massacre of shore and other wild birds. The railroads connected major game markets in large cities to wild birds hunting areas, the improvements in firearms, and finally an expanding population with an insatiable appetite for wildlife of all sorts. What was the scale of the massacre? Here is one anecdotal account. Quote, a wagon load of plover and curlew heaped higher than the sideboards was considered a fair bag, unquote. Peter Matheson wrote in the Shorebirds of North America, published in 1967, a favorite book of mine, and Peter was my mentor. Who all were the beneficiaries of the loots? The US president and his guests would be served roasted snipe, prepared with recipe from the book, the original White House cookbook, published in 1887. From the president to the people, all were relishing and were implicated in the demise of shorebirds. And finally, in closing, as the massacre intensified, the populations of shorebirds began to dwindle. The illustration based snipe that you see does not appear to be a depiction of the heyday of shorebird gunning, but rather skillfully anticipates the passing of that era. The image depicts scarcity, not abundance. The mood is somber, not celebratory, which the artist achieved with an overall pastel color palette. Like the artist, the naturalist of the time, government biologist, and also some of the hunters, the wealthy and the working class, were paying attention, becoming increasingly concerned. Public awakening combined with grassroots mobilizations eventually led to the passage of the historic 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which banned the sale of wild birds in the US and also banned hunting of most shore and other migratory birds. Despite the extraordinary scale of massacre and slow violence over 2 centuries, only one shorebird species went extinct, the Eskimo curlew. Today, shorebirds are considered to be the second most imperiled among all birds in the United States after grassland birds. Since 1974, the abundance of shorebirds in the US have declined by 37%. But as I speak with my colleagues who are engaged in shorebird science and conservation, no one, I mean no one, talks about extinction. They instead speak of the threats the shorebirds face and the major collective efforts they have instituted and are now instituting to mitigate those threats and ensure that the shorebirds survive and thrive. One such initiative is the Shorebird Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, pronounced WIZARD, which I was told is the second worst acronym in the world after East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership. I won't even try to pronounce that one. At the moment, we share this earth with 200 species of shorebirds. In the US, shorebirds are almost completely overlooked today by majority of the public, the press, and the politicians. When I set out to write this chapter, I had thought it would be about 5,000 to 10,000 words long, but I am already nearing 20,000 words, and there is still a fair bit left to write. I started that long chapter with mystery of shorebird migration that ornithologists talk about, in which sandpipers connect the pampas grasslands in Argentina to the Arctic tundra, a mystery that scientists have not been able to solve yet. And I end with a mystery of shorebird that the indigenous Maori people talk about. The bar-tailed godwit, which is a shorebird species, makes a non-stop 9,000 miles journey from Alaska to Aotearoa. The colonial name for the country is New Zealand, over the open Pacific Ocean, along the East Asian Australasian Flyway, and connects the Maori people in Aotearoa to the indigenous Yupik people of Alaska. Following centuries of colonial violence, today shorebird conservation is contributing to the revitalization of indigenous languages, music, dance, food, and cultures. Let us set aside the term extinction, or use it sparingly if absolutely necessary when we speak of biodiversity crisis. Let us instead come up with appropriate language to articulate population declines, die-offs, massacres, slow violence, and let us speak about Re-MEDIATE, which is the title of this conference, revitalize, such words. The public will connect with that more as they will be able to relate to their own experience. That would make mobilizing for mitigation a lot easier. We may even have an indigenous youth from Alaska or Aotearoa who will shout, "Our house is getting lonely," and ignite a global youth mobilization to mitigate biological annihilation. I pray that day will arrive sooner than later. The closing image that you see is an illustration by my student, Oleg Dedochas, who made the drawing for a class project last fall. Alec is creating drawings for the book that I'm now writing. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't go over too much. How do I stop share? Okay, let's see.
Okay, looks like you got it, Subhankar. Thank you so much.
I hope you were able to hear me, because with all this technology, I wasn't sure.
Wait, what, were you talking? Oh, you must have been on mute the whole time. Just kidding. Thank you so much. A virtual round of applause. Everybody want to just share some applause for Subhankar's talk, and thank you for that. So, Etsuko, were you going to say anything more now? You can just shake your head if not, or.
Oh, no, I wasn't planning to,
Okay,
but it certainly gave me a lot to think about, rethink, you know, the media communication. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
thank you so much. Yeah. Mark, your video is off. Maybe it's Is that you mean to keep it off? Or?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's off.
Okay.
But so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of field questions from the audience. So you can put your questions in the chat if you don't want to speak, or you can raise your hand in the Zoom call window. And to do that, you need to click on the participants button at the bottom, and then it'll open up the list of participants on the right side. And then at the bottom of that, you'll see a little button to push to raise your hand. So I'll try to keep an eye out for raised hands and for questions in the chat for Subhankar. I just want to say that from my point of view, your talk, Subhankar, was both intellectually stimulating and emotionally moving. And so you ticked the boxes there for me, for sure. And with all due respect to my colleagues, you know, this was a talk that brought new ideas into my mind and stimulated me, probably more than any other keynote that I've had at a COSI conference. So I'm just really pleased, and I hope everybody else feels similarly. So thank you again, and I'm now going to look for questions. So put your hand up, or probably faster to just type it in the chat.
Thank you, Mark, for that kind remark. If I can take just 5 seconds, if that's okay, to acknowledge something that I care about deeply. My dear colleague and friend, historian Finis Dunaway, is on this session, and Finis's book, Defending the Arctic Refuge, was published late last month by the University of North Carolina Press, a path-breaking book, because we have been talking so much about empowering the bottom, the grassroots, telling the story from the grassroots. That was the intent of my talk today. It isn't the experts at the top who have the last say. Finis's book honors that, the long history of the Arctic Refuge told through bottom up. And all the national newspapers, famous celebrities, everybody disappear in that 350-page book. So thank you. Yeah, just wanted to acknowledge that book. If you are curious about grassroots mobilization, environmental mobilization, and Finis is a historian of environmental visual culture, that probably many of you know more than I do. Yeah.
I just wanted to say to everyone that you don't necessarily have to have a question. If you want to make a comment, please feel free. And I'll make a comment. One thing that I really appreciate about your talk that's so important, and you know, I must admit I feel a little guilty because I am one that always stresses extinction, especially in my lectures with my students. We're in the 6th extinction. What are we gonna do? Let's get moving. But I also stress the importance of experience, that people have to experience climate change. They have to see it and they have to feel it. And I also teach social movements, and I talk about that. One's activism oftentimes actually comes from one's experience. So I'm very moved and motivated by what you said about it is when we witness this loss and this slow violence that we are most likely going to get people to take action. So I think from a communication standpoint, you are so right. We have to see it before and name it accurately before people are going to engage in advocacy. So thank you so much for framing this very differently. It's excellent.
Thank you. Thank you, Barb, for that comment. And like you, just 3 years ago, if you had asked me, I would be saying all of those things, 6th extinction, I taught Colbert's book, and so on. So, but I do feel honestly that your institution, your organization has probably the most to contribute to this dialogue at this very moment. Because with climate, we have come a long way. And we know that success is happening, whether policymaker, well, I mean, President Biden has at least instituted a whole of government approach, and that has happened because of public awakening and grassroots mobilization. I believe like your institution has so much role to play, like leading role. You can literally lead the biodiversity realm, because what is lacking is that front work hasn't happened. Like, you talk to people, extinction, but nobody has seen anything. Like, and you talk to like 1 million extinction. All of us are quoting 1 million extinction. When is that going to happen? Oh, how many of those 1 million will I get to see in my lifetime? Those questions are not being asked. So I think IECA probably can actually play the leading global role in biodiversity.
Well, thank you for that. That's a kind compliment. So we have a first question from Judy Friedlander in Sydney, Australia, and she thanks you for the keynote and asks, what, in your view, is the place of urban regeneration and species assistance to help counter the intransigence?
Thank you, Judy, for that question. And let me share with you a concrete example, a kind of a story. I'm a storyteller. So this was probably about 10 years ago, urban regeneration. And what was the second part of the question again, Mark?
What, in your view, is the place of urban regeneration and species assistance to help counter the intransigence?
Huge, 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 huge. So I'll give you one quick example, concrete example. This was probably 15 years ago or so. And at the time, my friend, E.J. McAdams, was the executive director of New York City Audubon, not the National Audubon, the city chapter. And they were recognizing that the birds are dying from crashing against windows, but nobody knew any data or what's happening, who are the culprits, and so on and so forth. So EJ and their small team with limited budget, not like the National Audubon budget, instituted a project to select a set of buildings all over the New York City. And as it turns out, at the end of it, the biggest culprit, and we used to joke about it in New York City every time I would visit him, biggest culprit was art. Metropolitan Museum of Art was apparently killing more birds than any other building that they had at least on their list of buildings that they were looking at, which was quite an eye-opener, right? So that was one story. In Toronto, there is an extraordinary work that is going on for more than 25 years. And the organization is called FLAP, Flight Light Awareness Program. And same subject. So between FLAP, Project Safe Flight in New York, Chicago, and other cities, they really are. And the way I think about it, when we are trying to save this species, that's why I ended with that example, they are helping us. So by trying to save shorebirds is actually contributing so significantly to the revitalization of indigenous language and culture that nobody would have thought of, because the work that my friend Brazilian ornithologist, not anthropologist, Liliana Neves is doing. She's the head of the Shorebird subsistence program at Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Back to the city. So that's one example. Other example is these domestic cats. The Cat Wars is a very important book. That's probably the second leading cause of avian mortality is, well, cats and windows, these two. I forgot which is second, which is third. But it's extraordinary numbers. Hundreds of millions of birds get killed by domestic cats that are actually go outside. So there is nothing wrong with having cats. They are our companion. But the ones that go outside and are free to roam will kill birds at an extraordinary level. And that book, after it came out, the writer had death threats. So urban regeneration, so much. And I live in Albuquerque, right? And it was an eye-opening for me. We did an exhibit, actually 5on6 Arts did an exhibit. This is not Our Species in Peril. There was an exhibit 2 years prior to that, in which there was a panel. And in the panel, mostly artists were there. One scientist was invited, who is from Argentina, and she was finishing her PhD at UNM. And she said, you know, you all art people, writers, you all are so exciting and interesting. I'm just a boring scientist. And so my talk will be kind of boring. And as it happened, she gave the most engaging and intriguing presentation. So I invited her back to my class, and that was the thing the students remembered the most. Anyway, all to say, that entire large 2-floor exhibit looked at bees. And as it happens, there are only 7 species of bees that are of commercial value. there are 19,993 bee species that we don't know much about at all. And they are not this commercially viable or bees like, what do you call, the bees that we, that otherwise we use, honeybees. Anyway, all to say, we learned that simply by leaving our backyard just as it is, without covering up with plastic so that weeds will come, or covering up with gravel because it looks nice, we create extraordinary habitats for these bees. And she came to the class and she showed these bees that are size of like a literally pinhead. Extraordinary. And New Mexico, as we later learned, is one of the most important places for bees in the US. It has 1,000 bee species just in New Mexico. So urban revitalization, to answer your question, and species help creates not only joy and excitement, which we talk about in literature, but it does something to us that are also of intangible values. It's our own cultural regeneration. So those are just a few examples. Extraordinarily important question. And Judy, if you're looking into these, if you're doing research, I'd love to know more, because again, most of us, a majority of the Earth's people live in big cities. So how can cities contribute to this whole crisis? Yeah.
Great, thanks, Subhankar. So yes, Judy is actually working on these things, and she's got a talk in the conference on it. So she's put a note in the chat you can look at later.
Oh, fabulous, fabulous.
And also Perdita Phillips has shared an example in the chat. Now we have a follow-up kind of related question from Jennifer Good, who is asked, also offers thanks, and then asks, what in your view is the role / importance of consumerism / materialism in extinction related work?
Enormous. So one of the things that, this is why the Shorebird chapter, I mean, we talk about these things, you know, consumerism and materialism. We know a lot. Many books have been written. But how does it relate to biodiversity? And what are we consuming, right? So it goes back to going all the way back, as that's why I said biological, the modern society and modern life is built on the backs of biological massacre. So this goes all the way back to 1500. So Richards writes about the massacre of fur-bearing animals, and the one that got hardest hit was beaver. All of that, and of course we know that beaver, which contributed to, as he claims, to the colonization of the United States. All to say that consumerism has been with biological annihilation from the get-go. If we start, let's say, at that 1500. So the other example is let's say whaling, like Arctic whaling, bowhead whales. Like those were all of the things that the whale products were being consumed by urban people, and the whale population went from pre-hunt, pre-industrial hunt, to when it stopped, 94% decline. But all of those products were being used in London and Netherlands. And in one of my pieces, I wrote about that the economy of Netherlands, the Dutch Golden Age, was made possible in significant part by the income that was coming from Arctic whaling. And the Dutch people created such large armies to protect their Arctic hunting grounds. To now, of course. Now, of course, those things. So those are some historical examples where, or the shorebirds. The shorebirds, now that I'm writing this chapter, is just so eye-opening. This level of massacres is mind-blowing. And they were being used, of course, for food at game markets, but also many of you know the plume trade. And in the plume trade, we only think about egrets and herons, but shorebirds were also being killed in large numbers to support the plume trade. So consumerism in its many facets is probably another extremely large and extremely important topic to look into. You know, many people have looked at the intersection of consumerism, materialism, and climate change. I think this is a subject that needs in-depth look, both historical and contemporary. So please, Jennifer, I would like to know more as you are looking into this subject. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got a note here from Nararaja Sri Skandaraja. We know him as Sri. He's one of our very familiar friends in Kosi. He hosted the conference in Uppsala in 2013. And so he writes, appreciate your bringing in Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan's book and his figures on number of tigers exterminated by British rulers and later carried on by Indian Rajas too. He told the story vividly once in Uppsala. As a fellow South Asian, may I highlight the latest figures on elephant kill in my backyard, Sri Lanka. Taking Manga Bay as trustworthy, 100 elephants killed in the first 3 months of 2021, 21 of them by electrocution by crude farmer-built electric fences. So there's not really a question in there, but it's more of a comment from Sri.
Heartbreaking, Sri, heartbreaking. Thank you so much. And I'll share with you just I was not, of course, aware of this, and this happened earlier this year, as you mentioned. And as I repeatedly say, that Manga Bay is my favorite go-to place when I'm looking at biodiversity reporting. Definitely not The Guardian. It is Manga Bay. Because of Manga Bay, India is just extraordinary, or Manga Bay, South Asia is extraordinary. All that said, with regard to the elephant, if there is anything to, whatever little hope. So right before COVID, so in February, late February, the UN Convention on Migratory Species of Wild Animals, it's a longer name than what I just said, but it's CMS. They had their 13th conference, CMS COP13 in Gandhinagar, Gujarat, India. And I was extremely fortunate to attend that conference. And at that conference, there was a incredibly amazing panel on elephants called Crossing Borders something, where the panelists were from Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, many countries, and both the massacre and the actual determination to help the species are both very heightened. An incredible work going on. And to share with you one heartbreaking story, as you shared about Sri Lanka, in India, extraordinarily painful stuff going on with captive elephants. There is a film called God in Chains or something like that. The name I think God in Chains. It just breaks your heart what is happening in the temple, in a temple, God in Chains, and the extraordinary abuse and pain. So thank you, Sri. I'd love to stay in touch and learn more about, but there is a lot of really extraordinary work now taking place with these international networks. So the elephant network, the tiger network, and of course the overlooked species are not ignored either, because the CMS mascot, or the signature species, was not one of these large iconic species, but great Indian bustard, which is extremely highly critically endangered now. But it's a bird, and that bird, not polar bear or elephant or tiger, was the mascot. Yeah. Thank you.
And Sri just followed up with another comment saying that the new wave of agricultural expansion to grow commercial maize for export chicken sector is pitching rural farmers and wild elephants against each other.
So that's where then comes back to consumerism and part of materialism, colonization. So yes, so agricultural expansion, yeah. Huge subject. That's what I tell students, that stay engaged, get engaged, because each of these threads that we are now discussing, and I'm sure throughout the conference we'll be discussing, each of these can lead to teams of students working and so on, right?
Okay, so Barb Willard, who now has put a comment in saying, currently there are a few products that have enormous impact upon habitat loss that leads to biodiversity loss. cattle grazing, for beef, palm oil, and petroleum. Also, if we were to stop consuming products made from these resources, we would see a great reduction in habitat loss. So,
absolutely true. Absolutely true. Those three things: industrial, agricultural expansion, for especially meat, production of meat, and palm oil, as you mentioned. Palm oil is having, we only think of Indonesia, but whoa, Northeast India, palm oil is devastating just incredibly biodiverse rich habitats in Northeast India as we speak. So yeah, right.
And my mistake, apologies to Carrie. Carrie Freeman had a question in there as well. And Carrie writes, I was struck by your respectful and compassionate terminology in referencing fellow animals. Can you tell us more about your conscious communication choices in describing non-human animals and your focus on them? Thank you.
Thank you. This is something, you know, as I have actually acknowledged, I mean, I openly talk about it, write about it, that when Etsuko introduced me, that I have all these degrees in physics and math. I have no degree in humanities. I have no degree in art. And yet I am now hold all this professor's position at a research university. Is my teachers are, first and foremost, are indigenous Arctic elders. They have been, they continue to be. And so anything and everything that I do today, first and foremost, I've learned from my indigenous teachers, primarily women, elders. So, so language is a very, very critical thing. And through them, like talking with them, being with them, is something that comes first, like before even we speak of something. So I'll give you a concrete example. It hit me. So in 1910, Wells Cook was one of the, he was the assistant at US Biological Survey, which is the predecessor of the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and wrote the first of its kind, and truly I still think it's probably one of the most important text on shorebirds. And he just wrote his text, simple, and he's a government employee, shorebirds distribution and migration or something like that, 100-page report. And in it, he gives sort of justification for why we need to preserve shorebirds. No better justification has since been come out. It's just so concise. The language is so both emotionally charged and scientifically accurate and so on. Anyway, but the way, and this is a epigraph will be on the chapter, is he talked about shorebirds as a national resource. In a very positive way, national resource. Here is this groups of dozens and dozens of bird species that are just being massacred at an extraordinary scale. So he wanted to draw attention. He called it a national resource and he gave a set of justification, all of which I honored. But then, of course, it hits me, national resource, to speak of a non-human animal as a resource. So I said in the early 20th century, probably that was just simply okay to call a non-human resource, but not for in our time. In our time, we speak of non-human animals with very different words. And that I learned primarily from my indigenous brothers and sisters and colleagues and elders. So thank you for that remark. And it's one of those things that can also help us move forward. So this language revitalization, this is what is happening with even shorebird work, with how we speak of an animal. Is if you ask an Yupik person, 20 different shorebird species, they'll say snipe. But then you go and ask them about in their own language, and they're of course now piecing it together, recovering lost language, lost words, and it's just a whole wide world. So with these different names is a world, a cosmology is built, right? So language is another extraordinarily important thing for, especially for biodiversity. Yeah, we can't talk about our non-human relatives as resource, or I don't know what. So or it as Robin Wall Kimmerer, who was, as many of you know, she's just so extraordinary. She was a speaker at the biodiversity webinar that Center Udall and I hosted, and one of the first things she said was eat. don't. So sometimes I sleep, right? I'm writing, then and then I catch it during whatever editorial phase. So this helps because then it becomes a story rather than just an object. Thank you for that question.
So, okay, thank you. So we just have a few more minutes left here, maybe time for one more question. And we've got one here from, well, a recommendation from Elizabeth Birch. If you haven't seen this project before, nonhumanrights.org, can you recommend any communication examples that are doing a good job communicating biodiversity protection campaigns and/or journalism? So Elizabeth's looking for examples of good communication there. And just to warn everybody, the call will cut off on the hour precisely. At that point, you should go into the next session, sorry, the coffee and cocktails, and we can continue conversations there.
Great, good. Thank you. I just want to take a moment. Yeah. Any good examples? I'll have to think about it. It's a really, really important point of communication. Mongabe is very good. And I give you a concrete example because Mongabe did an extraordinary profile article on my dear friend, a poacher turned mangrove conservationist. And just in the manner in which that article was written, that's what, when I speak of Anil Mistri's work, I always refer back to that article. So Mongabe is a very good source for some of these things. Non-human rights you mentioned. So there is, of course, so much work going on non-human rights, right? It's such a huge field. How are we communicating all that? I'm not entirely sure of, but let us all collectively start thinking. Like there are very important work going on, both in the scientific space, in the cultural space, in the scholarly space. How is it getting out to the public? Let us all collectively think about that. I honestly don't have an answer, but it's a really important question.
Okay, well, you know, we have a couple minutes here. I just want to say thank you again, Subhankar, for a wonderful talk and a big round of applause. Imagine standing ovation from everybody. We're very happy. We'll see people's comments in the chat now starting to flow in. And for everybody, please take a couple minutes break, get a beverage of some sort, and let's move into the coffee and cocktails session, the next session. You'll have to switch back to the schedule and switch into that window. I honestly don't know how it's going to go, but everybody just jump in and we'll try to have a conversation. So thank you again.
Everyone. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Etsuko. Thank you, Barb. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Thanks.